Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to BRICS. As Prime Minister Modi is on a diplomatic tour to 5 nations, he will also attend the BRICS summit. He has observed that BRICS will help create a multipolar global order. The second article is related to Quad, as the foreign ministers meet of Quad has issued a joint statement calling for justice for the victims of the Pahalgam terror attack. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the BRICS summit. Prime Minister Modi is going to attend the upcoming BRICS summit. He is currently on a diplomatic tour to 5 nations and he has observed that this summit will help in the creation of a multipolar world order. It assumes even more significance in the wake of the rising fissures, the cracks in the G7 grouping, and the emerging clout, especially economic clout of the BRICS grouping, the expansion of the BRICS grouping. Therefore, we will discuss the need for the BRICS grouping, the challenges that it faces, the expansion of the BRICS currency. This is important in GS2 under the topic bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India and affecting India's interests. BRICS is the name for the 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. It was established in 2006 at the G8 Outreach Summit when the leaders of the BRIC countries met. Therefore, it is a diplomatic coordination forum. It ensures the coordination among the countries of the global south. Initially, the grouping was formed by 4 countries: Brazil, Russia, India and China in St. Petersburg. And the first BRICS summit happened in 2009. Post that, in December 2010, South Africa was also added and the BRIC grouping became the BRICS in 2011. These economies serve as the main engines of the global economic growth. They are driving the global economic growth currently, and even the intra-BRICS trade has been growing. In 2001, it was less than $500 billion and it grew to close to $5 trillion in 2021. Now the BRICS grouping has also expanded to become BRICS Plus. Several nations have been added to it. The new nations which have been added to the grouping include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, even Saudi Arabia is shown to be a member of the BRICS on the BRICS website, although a Reuters report in May 2025 observed that it has not yet officially joined the BRICS grouping. But now if we observe, the clout of BRICS has been increasing as it accounts for about 46% of the world's population, about 30% of the world's GDP, and in terms of the purchasing power parity, it is close to 39% of the world's GDP as of the latest data. And the BRICS Plus grouping also accounts for more than 40% of the world's oil production, about 42% of the world's wheat production, 52% of the world's rice production. Therefore, they are the granaries of the world also. And if we compare it to the G7 grouping, then the total GDP of the BRICS Plus grouping has exceeded that of the GDP of the G7 grouping also. Let's have a look at some of the important initiatives taken up by the BRICS as well. It came up with the establishment of the New Development Bank. This is like an alternative to the Western twins, the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and IMF. It provides for the loans for the building of the infrastructure, for the building of the sustainable development projects among the member countries, and it also established the contingency reserve arrangement. This is $100 billion pool. It is to assist the member countries in case they are facing balance of payments crisis, the short-term balance of payments crisis, and therefore ensuring the financial stability among the member countries of the grouping. The BRICS also established the BRICS payment system. This was established as an alternative to the SWIFT. Russia was frozen out of SWIFT at the time of the Russia-Ukraine war. Therefore, the BRICS payment system was put in place. And the BRICS has also put in place the customs agreement. The customs agreement ensures that the trade can happen, the transport can happen faster among the member countries, and there is the establishment of a remote sensing satellite constellation also. that is to ensure joint observation and for the sharing of the technical data among the member countries. India is also contributing through our own resource SAT 2A. Now, what is the need for BRICS? The appeal of the earlier order, the G7 led order, has been declining. Even before that, what is the G7 led order? The erstwhile West followed the cherished principle of what is best for Caesar. Caesar being the United States president. That is what is best for USA. But it was opposed and there were demands for a global rule-based order. Therefore, the G7, the West wanted to impose upon the world its own ideal, its own version of the rule-based global order, in which it can manage the economic preferences, it can control the economic preferences in such a way that the lion's share of the global power lies in the old hands only, lies with the West only. Therefore, it came up with ideas like the end of the history, the demise of the biggest challenger to the West, the end of the Cold War, and therefore the reach of the international institutions like the IMF and World Bank. They were also the tools in the hands of the West to control the global order also. But now there is a decline in the appeal of this as well, because it is rigid, it is hierarchical, and it has been serving the Western interests only, and hence the developing nations were pushed away, and hence the need for platforms like BRICS. And the BRICS also serves as a flexible alternative also. It prioritizes the national interests. It ensures that sovereignty is respected, there is mutual respect among the nations, and there is no rigid hierarchical approach among the members. Plus, the decision making is inclusive in nature. It can serve as a platform for the global south to come together, to cooperate, to coordinate as a mouthpiece for the global south also. And the agenda that it takes up, it is non-confrontational. It is not projecting itself as anti-West, rather it is just a non-West platform where it is focusing upon the solutions, not the rhetorics. And it also has the economic as well as the demographic strength, as we can observe in terms of the numbers. The GDP of the BRICS nations in terms of purchasing power parity is close to $65 trillion, which is accounting for 39% of the global GDP as compared to the G7. The G7 accounts for less than 30% of the global GDP, accounting for just about $47 trillion. When we look at the numbers, the population demography also, the BRICS account for close to 4 billion people, whereas the G7 accounts for less than 1 billion people. Therefore, it is more representative in nature. Plus, the global trust has been growing for the grouping like BRICS, as there are already 11 members. If we consider Saudi Arabia also, 9 partners and more than 30 applicants also who wish to join the BRICS grouping, and it serves as a non-Western platform, not an anti-West platform. Therefore, it is not taking a confrontational approach. Also, it has the future potential, as it is the only bloc currently with having the means as well as the desire to shape a new multipolar world order. Now, why does India needs BRICS specifically? Through the membership of BRICS, we'll be able to ensure that we have strategic autonomy and multipolarity, because we'll be able to balance our foreign policy, because we are part of the Quad grouping also, and we do not want to be seen as part of the strategy of USA to contain China. And we'll be having the economic and geopolitical leverage also, because in the times of global economic fragmentation, the Western nations are going for protectionism. We can see the case of USA and the tariff threats given by the US president and the sanctions also. In that case, we'll be able to access the alternative institutions which may be built through the BRICS grouping. And we can also function as the voice for the global south through platforms like BRICS, because it serves as a platform for the cooperation in various spheres like climate change, ensuring equity for the developing nations, and also ensuring developmental indicators. And through the BRICS grouping, the governance reforms, the global governance reforms can be encouraged, especially in the international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, as well as the United Nations, and an inclusive multilateralism can be promoted. Through the expansion of the BRICS, we can explore more like-minded partnerships. Through the expansion, the countries like Egypt, Ethiopia and UAE, which have good relations with India, have been included into the BRICS, and they have similar approach like India. For example, in matters like sanctions, they do not toe the Western line regarding the sanctions imposed upon Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war, and at the same time, they are not outrightly calling for de-dollarization. They don't want to antagonize the West totally, just like Russia and China call for de-dollarization completely. Rather, the currency should be switched gradually. At the same time, India needs BRICS for the leadership role also. The India-led approaches, for example, the establishment of vaccine R&D center, the adoption of counter-terrorism action plan, digital infrastructure, the BRICS startup forum, etc., have been appreciated. And at the Kazan Declaration 2024, the India's candidacy for COP33 has also been endorsed in 2028. And at the same time, it functions as a bilateral diplomacy hub also, the BRICS summit meetings. For example, at the summit meeting itself, there are bilateral talks like Modi-Putin talks, which were held discussing the Kudankulam nuclear plant as well as the engagement of Indian citizens in Russian military. Such aspects are discussed. The Modi-G meeting, especially after the LAC agreement, and with the hope that there will be a return to the pre-Galwan status quo. There are calls that border peace is crucial for India-China ties, and the engagement with Iran also, especially with regard to the development of the Chabahar port. And through the BRICS, will be able to counter the Western dominance also, because it offers the alternatives in finance, for example, the New Development Bank, the alternatives in trade as well as technology also, and will be able to future-proof the influence as well, as will have a role in the redefining of the global rules rather than the following of the global rules which India had been doing. Now, how does the expansion of BRICS benefit India specifically? The inclusion of more members in the BRICS grouping will help India in exploring more strategic partnerships. We'll be able to expand our geopolitical influence also. For example, strengthening ties with the African nations, like the inclusion of Egypt, the inclusion of Ethiopia into BRICS, helps India in exploring deeper partnerships, and will be able to go for multi-alignment in West Asia, for example, balancing the ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And with UAE also, the economic ties will be bolstered further. We already have the comprehensive economic partnership agreement signed with the UAE in 2022. Now the ties will be strengthened even further. We'll have economic and trade advantages also. For example, Egypt is our 5th largest trading partner in Africa. We have the bilateral trade with them to the tune of $5 billion. With Saudi Arabia, it is even higher, to the tune of $50 billion. And Ethiopia is the largest beneficiary of the letter of credits from India, and will be able to push for multilateral as well as institutional reforms. For example, the expansion of the Global South representation, as more countries from the Global South are included into the BRICS grouping, and will be able to push for the UNSC expansion also, the United Nations Security Council, as most of the countries which will be added, they support India's permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, and the alternative financial mechanisms can be explored then. Will be able to ensure energy and resource security also through the expansion of the BRICS grouping. For example, Saudi Arabia, from there about 18% of India's oil imports happen. Ethiopia has one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. They can produce about 2 billion barrels of oil. And from Iran's Chabahar will be able to get connectivity to the Central Asia, ensuring both energy and resource security for India. Will be able to balance China's dominance also. If there is expansion of the BRICS grouping, there can be a diversified BRICS membership, and the dominance of China will be lower, and there can be an India-led consensus also which can be built. But there are challenges in the further expansion of the BRICS. For example, the Iran-Saudi tensions, they themselves have to be managed within BRICS, and the NDB will have a limited impact. For example, it has given about just $33 billion of loans as compared to the World Bank's yearly $100 billion of loans, and there will be a need for the internationalization of the Indian rupee also to reduce the dollar reliance for India. Now coming to another aspect of BRICS, there are calls for the adoption of a BRICS currency also. Why do we need a common BRICS currency? Because it can help us in reducing our dependency upon the US dollar, the dependency of the member nations of the BRICS. The US dollar is the hard currency and it is used for international trade. For example, when India imports oil, we have to pay in the US dollars. And due to that, the member nations can become victims of the US sanctions also. The USA imposes sanctions as per its own convenience. For example, the sanctions imposed upon Iran when there was Iran-Israel war, and the sanctions imposed upon Russia when there was Russia-Ukraine war. And it can weaponize the SWIFT also, the international payment system. For example, the exclusion of Russia from the SWIFT system and hence the establishment of the BRICS payment system. And even USA exports inflation. It exports inflation globally because of its dollar dominance, and through the BRICS currency will be able to strengthen the financial autonomy of the global south also. For example, we'll be able to explore alternatives to the IMF and World Bank. We'll be able to reduce the transaction costs in case local currencies are used for the international transactions. We'll be able to protect ourselves from the Fed policy shocks. We often keep on waiting for the Fed signals when it is going to go for the quantitative easing or the monetary policy tightening, etc. We won't be dependent upon that. Also, a common BRICS currency will ensure economic and trade benefits also. For example, it can lead to faster intra-BRICS settlements because of no dependency on dollar, and it will cause lower forex risks because of the lower exchange rate fluctuations which can happen, and it can give a boost to the new development bank of the BRICS also. Plus, we'll be able to go for a strategic counterbalance to the Western systems. For example, the diversification of the global reserve currencies and a multipolar financial system can also be built this way. But there are challenges that the adoption of a common BRICS currency will face. For example, there are economic disparities among the BRICS member nations. If we compare, there are vastly different economic strengths of the nations. If you compare China with Ethiopia, obviously the size of the economy is so different, and there is no fiscal union also, unlike for example the Eurozone, and there is a risk of the repeat of the Eurozone like crisis also in case a BRICS currency is adopted. We have seen what happened in the Eurozone. There were countries where the levels of development were not as compared to the other countries. For example, even today the GDP of the Germany is double that of Italy, and we all know about the PIGS countries, the Portugal, Italy, Spain, and which were termed to be the laggards, and they were not able to sustain that high debt levels while they were part of the Eurozone. And there will be the challenge of the geopolitical rivalries also. For example, the China-India tensions, the UAE-Iran rivalry, as well as the power imbalances, especially in the West Asian region. There will be technical as well as structural issues also in the adoption of a common BRICS currency, as there is no unified central bank. Therefore, what will be the mechanism to regulate the central BRICS currency? And there will be differing inflation and interest rates also. Therefore, the monetary policies can't be regulated as easily. Plus, some countries within the BRICS, they impose the capital controls also. For example, China imposes capital controls. And there is a lack of trust as well as lack of consensus also for the adoption of a common BRICS currency, as the monetary sovereignty may have to be ceded, and no country is willing to cede their monetary sovereignty for the adoption of a common BRICS currency. And there has been no precedent of adopting a currency union before a political integration. And we can see that there are pragmatic alternative solutions also. For example, we can go for the adoption of UPI. India's UPI is already functional in at least 7 countries. The adoption of central bank digital currencies. These are pragmatic alternatives also to the BRICS currency. Now, what are the challenges that BRICS faces? It is facing the challenge of institutional weaknesses. Especially the financial institutions, they are not strong. For example, the NDB, the New Development Bank, and the CRA, they are underdeveloped. Therefore, the local currency lending has not picked up. The progress has been slow on this aspect, and also the country system approach has been criticized. The country system approach means that the monitoring mechanisms are done by the agencies of that country only, and therefore the monitoring mechanisms are weak. They are not developed by the BRICS grouping itself, and there are geopolitical tensions also. For example, we know about the India-China rivalry, the border disputes, the sovereignty concerns due to the Chinese initiatives like especially the One Belt, One Road which passes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and the Russia and the West tensions. We can see the Russia-Ukraine war, the concerns regarding the expansion of BRICS also. There are structural issues as well. For example, the founding members of the BRICS, they have equal voting shares. But what will be the pattern when the new members are included and there is no supranational authority also to govern? The decisions are taken through consensus and often the decisions are hard to arrive upon. And also there are mixed priorities, because there are competing economies who are member nations of the BRICS, therefore the priorities are mixed. There are perception problems also for the BRICS grouping. For example, the BRICS is seen to be symbolic, especially the West criticizes the BRICS as a symbolic grouping also, and it does not do anything substantive, and they even call it as a talk shop which has turned into a talk mall now with the inclusion of more members into the BRICS, and the reform pace has been slow as compared to the Western institutions. Also, the vision on the alternative, the exploring of a BRICS currency or the alternatives to the dollar has not been a homogeneous one. Also, there are contradictions within the BRICS grouping also, like the economic contradictions. For example, the GDP of the member countries, they are vastly varying. The GDP of China alone is about 2 times the GDP of the rest of the members combined. And 2 of the countries are commodities exporters. China calls for the removal of protectionism. The other members are afraid that China may go for dumping. There are political contradictions also. For example, the India-China, especially the border concerns, the linking of the New Development Bank with the Silk Road projects. India objects to that. The political contradiction because of the US threats, the threats from the West as observed from the threats by Trump for the imposition of 100% tariffs upon the BRICS member countries if they take steps for the de-dollarization. And the geographical distance between the BRICS member countries is huge. These are countries from different continents. Therefore, there is limited trade. Although India has significant trade with China, but the trade with the other countries of the BRICS with respect to India is limited. And there are other similar forums also. For example, IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. Now, what are the future opportunities for the BRICS grouping? One, we can explore the cooperation in the non-traditional areas which has been expanding now. For example, climate, technology, infrastructure building, and it can be used as a lobby for pushing for the reforms in the international institutions like the World Bank, United Nations, etc. And it can be used for the creation of a balanced multipolar world order without going for an anti-West rhetoric or an anti-West agenda. There is a means practice question also. Examine the need for BRICS in the evolving global order. Discuss the implications of its recent expansion and the potential benefits it offers to member states. Also analyze the challenges associated with the proposal of a common BRICS currency in the context of global financial stability. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the Quad. The context behind it is the Quad foreign ministers meet, which issued a joint statement calling for the bringing of the perpetrators of the terror attack in Pahalgam to justice. Therefore, we will discuss the need of Quad for India, the challenges associated with it, and the future of Quad. This is important in GS2 under the topic bilateral, regional, and global groupings and agreements involving India and affecting India's interests. Quad was formed in 2004 at the time of the Indian Ocean tsunami. 4 countries came together and formed the Quad, that is Australia, India, Japan and USA, to coordinate the relief efforts during the times of the Indian Ocean tsunami. In 2006, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe proposed the creation of the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity through the coordination between the members of the Quad, and in 2007 Malabar exercises, Japan was also included. In 2007 itself, the first Quad officials meeting also took place. But after that, there was a kind of a collapse of the Quad grouping as Australia withdrew from the Quad, citing the antagonization of China. It didn't want to antagonize China, as China had protested the formation of the Quad. It even called it as CFOM, although it was afraid of its own encirclement at the time. And India also hesitated because it wanted the membership of the nuclear suppliers group, and China could have blocked it. And subsequently, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe resigned, and there was a lack of Australian support also. Therefore, the Quad grouping collapsed. But there was a revival from 2017 onwards, as the leaders met again in the 2017 ASEAN summit, and that was also the time when China was going for the aggressive. For example, we have observed already the Doklam in 2017, the Galwan in 2020. Therefore, India was also concerned. And in 2020, Australia also rejoined the Malabar exercises. Now the Quad includes joint military exercises, 6 working groups and an investors network also. And in 2021, the first in-person Quad summit took place, where the focus was mainly on vaccines, technology and infrastructure cooperation. Now, what is the need of Quad for India? The Quad can function as a strategic counter to China. For example, we can balance the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. China is expanding in our neighborhood. It affects our sovereignty. Therefore, we can counter the string of pearls strategy of China through the Quad. And we can ensure our maritime security also, because we also promote the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific region. We'll be able to deter the Chinese aggression as well, not only Galwan, Doklam, but also in the South China Sea. We can strengthen our regional influence also. Through the Quad, we can boost our Act East policy through coordination with Japan and Australia, and we'll be able to support the Sagar and Indo-Pacific Oceans initiative, and therefore go ahead with our Indo-Pacific vision. We can engage in the vaccine diplomacy, for example, our Vaccine Maitri initiative through the engagement with Quad. The Quad can give us economic and defense benefits also, ensuring the supply chain resilience. We don't have to be dependent upon China only, and we can engage in defense partnerships. For example, the signing of agreements with USA, the GSOMIA, COMCASA, LIMOA agreements with USA, and the military exercises, for example, Malabar exercise, OSINDEX exercise, JIMEX exercise with Japan, and we can take up a global leadership role also. India can function as a key Indo-Pacific power, providing for the net security provider in the Indian Ocean also, and we can engage in the democratic alliances against the authoritarian expansionism as observed through China's expansion, and the post-pandemic influence especially can be seen in the spheres of technology, climate and vaccine collaboration. But there are certain challenges which are posed by Quad for India. If India engages with the Quad, then there are certain geopolitical risks that we have to take. For example, the probable escalation of tensions with China because of the US-China antagonistic equation, and it can complicate our engagement with the BRICS as well as the SCO ties also. Our relations with Iran and Myanmar may be affected, because with respect to Myanmar, we need cooperation for ensuring the development of our northeast, for countering the insurgency in the northeast and ensuring connectivity with Central Asia through Iran. And there will be security concerns also. For example, India is the only country among the Quad members which shares a land border with China. Therefore, we are more vulnerable as compared to the other member countries of the Quad, and there is a risk of the Chinese retaliation therefore. Plus, there are implementation challenges also. The projects that may be taken up as part of the engagement with Quad, India has experienced a delivery deficit in the past. For example, the slow pace of the projects that we have taken up, like the implementation of Kaladan, the trilateral highway in the Southeast Asia, and there is competition from the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, the China's higher pace of the project development, like in Nepal, Bangladesh, even in Sri Lanka also. And there are certain strategic dilemmas also which India will face if we are engaging with the Quad deeper. Like, we'll go for the balancing act which will be required, and the regional distrust will also have to be addressed, as the smaller countries in the region, they may feel that this is part of the US-led containment strategy, and India has joined the US-led containment strategy of China, which is not the case. We'll have to dispel that notion also. Now, what can be the future of the Quad? One, we can explore the expansion of cooperation in some areas. For example, the vaccine diplomacy. We can export the vaccines to the Indo-Pacific region. We can manufacture them. USA can provide technology, Japan can provide finance, Australia can provide the logistics in the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, we can explore the vaccine diplomacy. We can collaborate in the technology and the 5G sector, especially as China is wishing to build the Sinosphere, that is its initiative to control the digital world also. Therefore, the initiatives like the ban on Huawei, the app restrictions are steps in this direction only, and the collaboration can be done in the infrastructure building and the climate initiatives also. The strategic evolution also has to be done for the Quad. The bloc has to become from the security dialogue to an action-oriented bloc to focus upon the common areas of interest, for example, the maritime security, freedom of navigation. The institutionalization potential also has to be explored. For example, the regular summits, the setting up of joint working groups, etc. And the Chinese response will also have to be countered. The China will naturally go for the opposition in case the Quad goes for deeper collaboration. There, India's leadership role will come into picture. We have to project it as not an anti-China grouping, rather the collaboration in the Indo-Pacific region. The long-term vision can be for defining the engagement terms with China so that there is no direct confrontation, and the mainstreaming of the Indo-Pacific concept that India can push for. Let's also have a look at some of the areas where the Quad has been focusing and the significant initiatives that have been taken up. It has been focusing on collaboration in the maritime security and domain awareness, and for that only the Quad launched the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, and Australia also participates now annually in the exercise Malabar. For seeking collaboration in the counter-terrorism, the ministerial level Quad Counter-Terrorism Working Group has been established. For ensuring nuclear stability, there have been calls for denuclearization of North Korea, and for ensuring the critical minerals supply, the Quad has established a semiconductor supply chain initiative also in 2021. For ensuring sustainable, transparent, fair lending and financial practices, the Quad Investors Network was launched, and the inaugural Quad Investment and Technology Dialogue also took place. For ensuring collaboration in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, the 4 countries have formed the coalition to coordinate the aid following the Indian Ocean tsunami, and the Quad partnership on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is now established. There is a means practice question also. Discuss the strategic significance of the Quad for India in the current geopolitical landscape. What are the challenges that India faces as a member of the Quad? Please try to write it. The next article is related to Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. This is important in GS1 under the topic Indian culture. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism. He is considered to be the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama, and he is both the political and spiritual leader of the Tibet. The title Dalai Lama, which means Ocean of Wisdom, was conferred first by the Mongol ruler Altan Khan. He is considered to be the human incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is the Bodhisattva of compassion and patron saint of Tibet. Bodhisattvas are those who are enlightened, but they live amongst people to alleviate their sufferings. The first incarnate was Gendun Drup, who was the first Dalai Lama. But ever since the China's occupation of Tibet in 1950, the Dalai Lama has been living in exile in India. The current Dalai Lama is the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. He established the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamshala, India. He even transferred the political authority to an elected Sikyong. Sikyong means president in 2011. and he was conferred upon the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989 for non-violent resistance. Now, what is the selection process for the new Dalai Lama? The new Dalai Lama is selected through the Tulku system, which means the reincarnation of the Dalai Lamas, of rebirth within the Sansar. Sansar means the cycle of birth, death and rebirth, and the Dalai Lama who is selected, it is drawn by lot from the golden urn usually, and the approval is then given by the Tibetan monastic authorities. The Chinese have been asserting that the selection of Dalai Lama has to be done as per the Chinese law. That is order number 5 2007 that China came up with, that China has the authority over all reincarnations. They rejected the nominee of the Dalai Lama and installed on Panchen Lama also in China, and they quote the 1793 King Decree saying that the selection of the High Lamas, the Dalai Lama, has to be done via the golden urn only, and the next Dalai Lama must be born in China as per Chinese claims. Now let's discuss a few facts regarding the Tibetan Buddhism also. The Tibetan Buddhism was sent in 7th century via the Indian Mahayana traditions only, and it merges the Mahayana with the Vajrayana rituals, mantras and the initiation rites, and it absorbed within it the indigenous Bon religion also in Tibet. There are 4 major schools there: Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya and the Gelug school. The Gelug school became the dominant school by the 15th century under the Mongol patronage, and it follows the Gelugpa tradition which was established by Tsongkhapa. The Tibetan canon is based upon the Kangyur, that is Buddha's own words, and the Tengyur, which are commentaries by the scholars, these 2 texts. Now coming to the article, the 14th Dalai Lama has said that the centuries old institution of the Dalai Lama would continue, and the Garden Phodrang Trust, a non-profit organization set up by his office in 2011, would have the sole authority to recognize his reincarnation, whereas China has rejected the succession plan and reiterated that any future heir must receive its seal of approval. There are presently 3 registered institutions that are related to the Dalai Lama in India. One is Garden Phodrang Trust, which is a registered body in India. Another is the Dalai Lama Trust, which is a non-profit organization. And another is the Garden Phodrang Foundation, which is registered in the Zurich. Out of these, the Garden Phodrang Trust will be responsible for finding the reincarnation, and the members should consult the various heads of Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the reliable oath-bound dharma protectors who are linked inseparably to the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. They will accordingly carry out the search procedures and identify the reincarnation. The next article is related to India-Ghana relations, as Prime Minister Modi is on a visit to Ghana currently. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding India-Ghana relations also. The India-Ghana have historical ties. We set up our office in Accra in Ghana in 1953 itself, even before Ghana got independence in 1957, immediately after which we set up diplomatic ties also with Ghana. We have bilateral mechanisms put in place, for example, the establishment of Joint Trade Committee in 2024. Ghana even participated in India-Africa Forum Summit in 2015. We are cooperating in the economic sector as well, as Ghana can serve as our gateway to the economic community of the West African states, and in terms of trade, it is a significant partner. The bilateral trade between India and Ghana in fiscal year 2024 was to the tune of $2.5 billion. The major items that Ghana exports to India are gold, which account for 70% of Ghanaian exports to India, apart from cocoa and cashew nuts. The major items that Ghana imports from India are pharmaceutical products, machinery, vehicles, plastics. India even goes for investments in Ghana. The Indian FDI in Ghana accounts for almost $2 billion from 1994 to 2024, and we are the second largest investor in Ghana in 2024. There are developmental projects that India has assisted Ghana with by providing lines of credit as well as grants. We give them concessional credit, for example, in the building of the presidential complex, the building of the Tema Mapakadan railway line, as well as the grant assistance for the ICT upgrades, the investments in the health and education sector in Ghana. We are going for capacity building also there by providing scholarships by the Indian Cultural Center, the Indian Technical Economic Corporation, and the tele-education initiatives taken up through eVidya Bharati. We have socio-cultural ties also with Ghana. For example, for cultural exchange, there is the Festival of India which is celebrated there, the International Yoga Day, and there are media and academic exchanges as well. There is Indian diaspora in Ghana to the tune of more than 15,000 Indians, and there are cultural associations, temples, the establishment of Gurudwaras, the ISKCON also in Ghana. There are some agreements also which are put in place between India and Ghana, which include the Air Services Agreement, visa waiver for diplomats, the memorandums of understanding on ICT, nuclear energy, standards, pharmacy, etc. Let's also have a look at some of the facts regarding Ghana as well. It is formerly known as the Gold Coast. It is Africa's first independent nation. The meaning of Ghana is warrior king. It is derived from the ancient empire in West Africa, and it was also having the history of slavery. It was part of the transatlantic slave trade route through the historic forts of Cape Coast and Elmina. It also has the Volta Lake. Volta Lake is the largest man-made lake in the world, and there are day-based naming traditions which are adopted in Ghana. That is, the newborn children, they are named after the days of the week. And there is the Kent cloth which is framed in Ghana. It is the hand-woven cloth, and it was also the victim of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars which took place from 1823 to 1900 between the British and the Ashanti Empire. And it is a region, a country of democratic stability in a region which is normally infested with the coups. Therefore, India is collaborating more with Ghana. Now coming to the article, this gesture of the visit by Prime Minister Modi is reflective of the strong and historic bonds of friendship between the two nations, and it would deepen our partnership, and it underscores India's commitment to strengthening our engagement with Africa and Global South partners. This is the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Ghana in the last 3 decades, and it is our valued partner in the Global South and plays an important role in the African Union as well as the ECOWAS. The talks are aimed at deepening the two countries' historical ties and opening up new windows of cooperation, including in the areas of investment, energy, health, security, capacity building, and developmental partnerships. Prime Minister Modi will also hold talks with the President of Ghana to review the bilateral partnership and enhance the ties through economic, energy, and defense collaboration. The next article is related to the phone tapping order of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which was quashed by the Madras High Court, and the right to privacy. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding phone tapping in India. Who can tap phones in India? At the state level, it is the state police which can tap the phones. At the central level, it can be the Intelligence Bureau, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Enforcement Directorate, the Narcotics Control Bureau, the Central Board of Direct Taxes, the Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, the National Investigation Agency, the RAW, the Directorate of Signal Intelligence, and the Delhi Police Commissioner. What are the laws which govern the phone tapping in India? It is governed as per the Indian Telegraph Act 1885. Section 5 subclause 2 of the Indian Telegraph Act governs the phone tapping. It can be allowed if there is a public emergency or for public safety, for ensuring national security and public order. But there are exceptions for the press, that the journalist messages cannot be tapped unless specifically prescribed by the law, and in case the journalist messages are tapped, the written regions have to be recorded by the tapping authority. Who authorizes phone tapping in India? It can be authorized as per Rule 419A of the Indian Telegraph Rules 2007. At the central government level, the authorization can be given by the Home Secretary. At the state government, the State Home Secretary can give the authorization. In the emergency cases at the central level, the Joint Secretary can also authorize the phone tapping, provided that he has been authorized by the Home Secretary. And at the state level, the person of the designation of Inspector General of Police or higher can go for the phone tapping authorization, and these approvals must be confirmed within 7 days or the tapping will have to be stopped. In the remote areas, the phone tapping does not need any prior approval if it is impractical, but the competent authority must be informed within 3 days when the phone tapping starts. Now, what are the checks against the misuse of the phone tapping provisions? One, it has to be used as a last resort principle only. Only if there is no alternative which exists apart from the phone tapping, otherwise the right to privacy will be violated. Also, the duration and renewal are restricted. The initial order can give the phone tapping activity for 60 days maximum, and it can be extended for up to 180 days total. The review committees have to be set up at the central level. The cabinet secretary along with the law and telecom secretary are there, and at the state level the chief secretary along with the law secretary and the home secretaries are there. They have to meet every 2 months to review the phone tapping requests. Also, the data so collected has to be destructed. The government records have to destruct the data so collected every 6 months unless it is needed. And the service providers, they have to delete the logs within 2 months of the stopping of the interception. Now, coming to the article, the Madras High Court quashed a 2011 order which was issued by the Union Ministry of Home Affairs for the tapping of a phone, citing that it violates the right to privacy under Article 21 of the Constitution. This was done, the surveillance was ordered for a CBI probe involving the alleged 50 lakh bribe given to a senior income tax official. The court has observed that the state's justification for surveillance did not meet the legal threshold which is required to invade an individual's privacy. In the instant case, the impugned order does not fall within the ambit of public emergency or the interest of public safety. Therefore, it was a covert operation or a secretive situation for the detection of a crime which would not be apparent to any reasonable person. As the law presently stands, it does not fall within the provisions which allow for the phone tapping under section 5 subclause 2, that is public emergency or public safety. Therefore, the court laid down the conditions under which the phone can be tapped. It has been laid down under the earlier case of PUCL versus Union of India that the phone can be tapped during a public emergency or in the interest of public safety only, and nothing in these conditions were secretive or abstract. Therefore, they must be apparent by any reasonable person. The intercepted conversations were also not placed before the review committee as mandated by the Rule 419A of the Telegraph Rules. Therefore, the procedural safeguard designed to protect against executive overreach was also violated. The next article is related to the artificial intelligence and the copyright law. This is important in GS3 under the topic awareness in the fields of IT, space, computers, robotics, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and the issues related to IPR. There were two cases in which the judgments were given in favor of the artificial intelligence companies. One of the cases was the writers versus the Anthropic. Here a lawsuit was filed by the journalists and the writers. It was a class action complaint against Anthropic. The allegation was they had gone for the unauthorized use of their copyrighted books to train their AI, the Claude AI. The defense of Anthropic was that they had used the Books 3, a pirated book database. They acknowledged that, but they had also purchased and scanned millions of books for training, and the use of AI was transformative and it fell under the fair use. The court ruled there that the AI training aims to create something different. It is transformative and it is not replicative. Another suit was Writers versus Meta. This was a lawsuit filed claiming that copied books from shadow libraries had been used to train their models. The libraries like Books 3, Anna's Archive, the LibGen, they are a host of the pirated versions. The defense of the AI company was that they had post-trained the models to prevent the memorization of that content and from preventing them from outputting of the copyrighted text. Here again the court ruled in favor of the AI company Meta, saying that there is lack of evidence on the market harm which is caused to the writers, but at the same time they urged the tech firms to compensate the copyright holders. There is a case against OpenAI in India also, filed by the ANI News Agency, the Digital Newspapers Association including Indian Express, Hindustan Times, NDTV, etc., even the music industry, claiming for the copyright violation. The case has not been decided yet. The arguments from the side of OpenAI are that it is not storing the data directly, and there is no prohibition on the use of data under the Indian laws, and it is like comparing it to the reading of a book. They are also saying that the Indian court does not have the jurisdiction to decide it, as it does not have any office in India. Also, the pre-training processes take place outside India. The training data is also stored on the foreign servers, therefore there are jurisdictional concerns. And the models that are so developed, they don't have the access to the original training data anymore. And also it claims not to be a market rival of the ANI as it links the sources of information as well. Now, what is the significance of these rulings? One, in both the offshore rulings, the tech companies have won, and the fair use arguments has been reinforced for the training data. However, the legality of using pirated data sources has still been unresolved. There are ongoing battles also. For example, the music publishers, they sued the Anthropic regarding the copyrighted lyrics, and the New York Times and other publishers, they also have the pending lawsuits. There are unsettled issues. For example, the courts acknowledge the transformative potential of the AI, but there is still the need for creator compensation as well. Therefore, there will be global implications for the copyright law, which is still uncertain. The next article is related to the gig workers in the labor data. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy. As per the Niti Aayog, the gig workforce will account for about 23 million by 2030. The gig workers have been included in the periodic labor force survey, but there is no specific classification for them. They have been classified under the vague categories like self-employed, own account workers and casual labor. There are gaps in the labor classification therefore. There is a legal definition provided in the Code on Social Security 2020. The Chapter 1, Section 2, Subclause 35 provides for the definition of the gig worker as the person who earns outside traditional employer-employee relationship. Even the platform work has been defined to be the one where the online-based service arrangements are put in place. But the ambiguity persists as there are no clear operational definition in the surveys. There are policy challenges. For example, the Social Security Fund exists, but the data-backed implementation is not there. There is a National Social Security Board also. It relies on the periodic labor force survey, which lacks the gig-specific data. Now, how the periodic labor force survey falls short? One, there is no dedicated category for the gig workers. They are lumped with the traditional self-employed workers. It fails to capture the algorithm-dependent work. It fails to capture the multi-platform job roles, the lack of the formal contracts as well as the income volatility as they are dependent upon the big companies. There is hybrid work nature also which is ignored by the PLFS. For example, the delivery riders on Swiggy, Zomato, they are counted as self-employed. The government response in the Rajya Sabha to a question is that the gig work has been included under the economic activity, but there is no specific tracking regarding it. So therefore, there has been their recognition, but the representation has been lacking. For example, the policy efforts have been taken up by the 2025 budget by extending the social security schemes for the gig workers, by going for the e-Shram registration, providing them with digital IDs and the coverage under the Ayushman Bharat also. The periodic labor force survey 2025 went for the larger sample size and the monthly estimates, but still the gig specific classification is not there. Therefore, there is a need to revise the PLFS also and go for a dedicated gig economic module so that accurate data can be collected for an inclusive policy making. Thank you.